Welcome to Prevention Is Now. I'm Deb Bonner, preventionist and community advocate for Perry Center Against Sexual Assault. Desktops, laptops, tablets, smartphones, the entire world is at our fingertips 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And while this kind of connectivity can have advantages, there are some significant dark sides too. Technology-facilitated sexual violence, or TFSV, is a serious issue affecting people of all ages. According to their article, Sexual Violence and Harassment in the Digital Age, Anastasia Pal and Nicola Henry discuss 5 key areas where technology can be used to perpetrate or extend sexual and gender-based harm and violence, including technology-enabled assault, image-based sexual abuse, cyberstalking and criminal harassment, online sexual harassment, and gender-based harassment and hate speech. And according to a report published in 2019 by Common Sense Media, a nonprofit that promotes safe technology and media for children, the average U.S. teen spends 7 hours and 22 minutes online. So not only are teens at significant risk for TFSV, but also perpetrating in the form of digital dating abuse. To help us find out more about the topic is Dr. Lauren Reed. Dr. Reed is an assistant professor in the School of Social Work at Arizona State University with a PhD in social work and developmental psychology. Her primary focus is on teen dating and sexual abuse prevention using community-based and youth participatory methods, paying particular attention to the role of social media and mobile phones in digital dating abuse and how media can be a context and tool for abuse. So, Dr. Reed, welcome. And if 2020 taught us anything, that we all live our lives online now.
Thank you so much for that introduction. It's great to be with you today and talking about this issue.
So according to the American Psychological Association, 41% of girls and 37% of boys between the ages of 14 and 20 report experiencing physical, sexual, or emotional abuse in a relationship. What kind of abuses, especially as they relate to sexual violence, are we seeing in the digital formats?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. So in my work, I categorize digital dating abuse into 3 different types of abuse. One of them is sexual abuse, so that will be our focus today. So I sort of see it as 3 different types. The first is digital monitoring or control. So these are things that you would do to use technology to control your partner's whereabouts, their activities, who they're hanging out with, what they're doing when they hang out with those friends, or monitoring their activities. So checking out like where they're at, what they're doing, pressuring them to respond quickly to messages when they send them, things like that. That's the most common form of digital dating abuse. And so that's something that we talk about a lot, is this sort of monitoring, constant connection. Another type of digital dating abuse I talk about is digital direct aggression. And that is when you're using technology to overtly harm, humiliate, embarrass, expose your partner. So this would be like sending threats, spreading rumors about your partner, sending private information to like large groups of people, that kind of thing. And then finally, digital sexual abuse, which I see as the use of digital technologies to pressure or coerce your partner or anyone into sexual activity. And this includes a lot of stuff around sexting, right? So we hear a lot about the issues of sexting and technology in relationships. And we know that the majority of sexting that goes on between teens these days is not coercive. So the majority of sexting is wanted, and it's usually a positive experience for teens. But we're seeing an increase in sort of awareness around coercion around sexting. And girls are particularly likely to experience coercion around sexting. So when I think about digital sexual abuse, I think about using technology to pressure your partner to have sex. So sending a lot of messages about having sex, about don't you want to do this with me? You know, I think we should do this. If you loved me, we would do this, that kind of thing. And then also pressuring for sexual content, sexual photos, sexual videos, and then maybe using those sexual content or videos to bribe your partner or sending that content to people without their permission. So a lot of things happen around sexual coercion and technology.
When you talk about sexting in the form that it is mutual and non-coercive, are we seeing threats like, we found out fairly early on in the pandemic that Zoom can be crashed with inappropriate material. And I know the schools have worried a lot about that. So are the abuses that we're seeing typically among consensual relationships that are not healthy, or are we seeing outside influences as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think everyone's sort of scrambling right now to understand the impacts of the pandemic on youth, right? And how is it impacting youth mental health broadly? And then how is it impacting relationships and sexual activity? Obviously, if teens are not in person, if they're not seeing their partners or other kids their age, they're less likely to be having sex, right? So your in-person sort of sexual coercion and sexual abuse is going to decline. And so how I think about it is I don't think about it as such a separation between offline abuse and online abuse. So we see across many studies in this area that it's the same kind of abuse, just in different contexts. So if someone is experiencing abuse online, they're often also experiencing abuse offline. So it's rare that you're experiencing one or the other because of just the nature of communication with teens these days. They're both seeing each other in person and talking online. So it all kind of bleeds together. So I imagine with the pandemic that what we're seeing is just more of that stuff is happening online than it was before, because more of our communication is online than it was before. So I'm not sure that like overall sexual abuse or digital dating abuse is increasing. It just might be the different context that it's happening in, which means that it's even more important for us to understand how digital technology impacts abuse, because if we're going to be interacting more online, we need to pay attention to that. But in general, when we think of sexting, and especially sexting coercion, sexting most often happens for youth in relationships. So I know that there's a lot of, I think like the popular media view of sexting is that like kids are just sexting anybody all the time. But when you actually talk to teens about sexting, they're most often sexting partners. So it's usually within consensual romantic relationships. And like I said before, most of the time, it's a positive experience for them. Of course, there's risks associated with sexting, you know, if that information gets out, and we need to educate teens on the potential consequences of sexting. But their emotional experience of it is usually positive, unless the photos are unwanted, unless they're receiving pressure or coercion to send those photos, or if those photos get put into the hands of people that they didn't intend to. But yeah, that's usually happening between romantic partners.
So do boys and girls experience digital dating violence in the same way? And are hetero relationships impacted by digital violence the same way as relationships that are on the LGBTQ spectrum?
Yeah, that's a great question. And sort of studying the gender dynamics of digital dating abuse is actually the main focus of my work. So it's something that I think about a lot. So I think like the general takeaway is that girls, sexual and gender minority youth, and youth of color are all more at risk for all forms of youth victimization. So those groups are definitely more at risk for various structural reasons. And so when we think about digital dating abuse, yes, girls and boys and all gender identities experience digital dating abuse, but girls and sexual and gender minority youth tend to bear the brunt of the consequences and experience it more negatively. So if you look at just like the number of times they've experienced things, it looks like boys and girls and youth who are heterosexual or on the LGBTQ spectrum are experiencing it at about equal rates. But when you ask them about those experiences, they're impacting girls and sexual gender minority youth more than boys. So we're more concerned about sort of emotional distress, depression, suicidality, social consequences. We're way more concerned about those things among girls and LGBTQ youth than with boys. I sort of say it's important to not just ask about the frequency, but it's important to ask about the emotional experience and the consequences of these experiences. And when it comes to digital sexual abuse in particular, so thinking about sexual abuse, girls are much more likely than boys to experience that form of digital dating abuse. So that's pretty clear.
We're talking with Dr. Lauren Reed, an assistant professor in the School of Social Work at Arizona State University and an expert in the field of teen digital dating abuse. Are the traumas from digital dating and sexual abuse different than the traumas experienced in the physical world?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, there's a ton of overlap between offline and online abuse. So it's really hard for researchers to disentangle what consequences are due to in-person abuse and which consequences are due to digital abuse. So we know that digital sexual abuse has really severe consequences for youth. It's sexual coercion, sending sexual information to people that weren't intended can be really traumatic for youth and have a lot of consequences for them. I'm not as clear I don't know if it's as clear of how we separate the consequences from in-person abuse because they're both likely to be happening at the same time. What I will say is that the characteristics of online sexual abuse are different because it's easier to spread that information. So if you're experiencing sexual abuse with a partner, that might be a private thing that maybe others don't know about unless you're telling people. But with digital sexual abuse, it's often a much more public thing, and it leaves a mark that can be hard to erase. So if a sexual photo or video goes viral, it's really hard to sort of reverse it and make sure that nobody has that information anymore. So we hear about secret Dropbox accounts where teens are storing sexual photos of their partners and there's a password that only a few people know. Sometimes teachers or parents will find out about those, shut them down, but then somebody else just copies it and starts another one. So I think that the consequences can be worse in the sense that sometimes it's harder to erase and move on from those things because there's sort of that digital trace. But I think in general, it's hard to disentangle what's worse.
And do we really fully appreciate at this point? Because this digital frontier is still fairly new. We think that we've had these smartphones forever, but the reality is they've only been around 10, 15 years. So do we even really fully appreciate the full impact that this could have? Because we always tell our kids what you do online is going to follow you through life. And we really just haven't had a chance to see a lot of that yet.
100%. And I think my training in adolescent development has been really helpful here because, I think it's smart to teach teens that they need to think about the long-term consequences of their digital behaviors because you're right. If they send something, if something goes viral, it could impact them across the lifespan. We see this all the time where people who are public figures have old tweets that are dug up that maybe they said things that were offensive when they were teens and that impacts their adult life. So there's definitely consequences. However, that's really hard for teens to process. So where they're at in their adolescent development, they don't like to think about long-term, and long-term is really hard for them to process compared to adults. And what they're concerned about is like right here, right now, what's going on with my relationships? How do I feel about my friends? What's going on in my life? So it's really difficult to convince them sometimes that those long-term consequences, what that will be like. So I think it's smart to keep talking to them about it, but that can't be our only message because I think it's harder for teens to think about long-term consequences.
It's no secret that the internet is full of explicit content. I mean, there's free porn sites all over the place. A lot of the video games are hypersexualized. Do you think the kind of access to this type of graphic material is exacerbating the issue?
That's a good question. And pornography and online pornography is not my specific area of focus, but of course it overlaps with a lot of the things that I work on. So there's a lot of thoughts about sort of the easy access of pornography for teens nowadays. So there's a lot of panic around it, right? So parents in particular are very worried that teens have such free, easy access to pornography. And then other groups are sort of taking another approach where they say, I think this is here to stay. It's really hard to keep teens away from these images. They're going to encounter online pornography. So instead of just panicking about it, let's try to talk to teens and be proactive about it. So a lot of those sort of media effects literature and a lot of the stuff around media and parenting talks about critical thinking around pornography and sexual material. So if you can talk to teens about how pornography is is created, who's in charge, who's exploited when pornography is created, especially free pornography. That can help them to understand what's real and what's not and give them a context. If you're just letting them look at all of these images and think that it's real and think that that's how people have sex and that's a true portrayal of human sexuality without any critical thinking around that, I think that's the most problematic thing. So there's a lot of groups working on how to teach teens to critically think about pornography and how to separate what's real and what's supposed to be entertainment. And of course, there's a lot of violent imagery and offensive imagery that we want to process with teens as well. But it's a tough issue because people don't always want to talk about pornography, and it's sometimes easier to pretend it's not happening.
And there's one thing you can't do is ignore it because it is literally everywhere.
Exactly.
In the digital world, there is like a million different platforms right now. I mean, it used to be that we just had a couple of social media sites. You had Facebook, and then you have Twitter, and now we have Instagram, and you have TikTok, and you have Snapchat, and you have Kik, and you have all of these different platforms, and all have their advantages and disadvantages. Are there certain ones that are better, I guess, for lack of a better word, at enabling this problematic behavior?
Yeah, so that's been an interesting sort of evolution in the field. So I've been doing this work about 10 years now, and when I first started doing this work, everybody was very interested in different platforms. And is Twitter or is Snapchat more or less dangerous than texting? And all of the research was very platform specific. So they would study like what's happening on texting, what's happening on Instagram, what's happening on Twitter. And what we kind of learned is that because there's such an overlap in online and offline abuse, and because teens are using all of these platforms on multiple devices all the time, it kind of all blends together. So if you're in a relationship that's coercive and abusive, they're likely using multiple platforms to exert power and control over their partners. So I think platforms that allow for anonymity, so things like Snapchat can be particularly problematic because you can screenshot snaps that are meant to go away after a few seconds and then send that material to other people. So things that allow for saving without the sender's consent or allow for anonymity can sometimes exacerbate abuse. But what we're seeing is that if you're in a relationship that's experiencing abuse, it's kind of blending through all the platforms that you're using, and it's often not just one.
Now, in the physical world, one of the more promising forms of primary prevention is bystander intervention. Can that work in the digital world? And if so, how does that work? And what other types of prevention are we seeing being developed to help combat some of the abuses we're seeing online?
Yeah, prevention is a huge interest of mine, and I think it's a great direction for us to be going in. You know, what do we do about this? How do we prevent teens from experiencing this? And bystander intervention is a great way to go. So I think that digital abuse and digital sexual abuse is a social phenomenon. So it's perpetuated and tolerated because it's accepted by society in a lot of ways. And so if we can sort of build online spaces that don't tolerate that behavior, where teens police themselves, I think that can really help survivors, and people are likely to stop being abusive if they think that they will have social consequences and if it's not seen as cool anymore. So I always say, like, a social problem needs a social solution. So building sort of group accountability online among teens, I think, is really important because they're so oriented to their peers and what their peers think of them. So a bystander intervention is one model for how to do that. I've also heard from working directly with teens that sometimes bystander intervention, especially for girls, LGBT youth of color, so youth with more marginalized identities, can actually be really dangerous. So if they sort of stand up for a friend online, if they see something problematic happening, there could be a whole bandwagon of people that just pile on top of them and start sending them harassing and threatening messages. So a lot of times teens are afraid to speak up online because they don't want that sort of barrage of harassment that might come with it. So there's sort of that additional barrier that isn't quite the same with in-person bystander intervention, but I think we need to pay attention to. Other things that people are talking about in terms of prevention are things like digital boundary, like teaching teens digital boundaries in relationships. So as part of a broader sort of healthy relationships model, when you're in a relationship, how to have conversations with your partner about your personal digital boundaries, what you're comfortable with, what kind of level of contact and access you like to have to your partner online, and sort of working some of those things out before conflicts arise. Because once conflicts happen, things tend to get out of hand, right? So some teens like to have all of their partner's passwords, like to send each other sex messages, and that is like really comfortable for them. But other teens might not want that. So having those conversations about boundaries and how to negotiate those, I think is another promising direction. And so we're working that out in the field of what's the best way to prevent these things. Awareness is always the first step, which I think we're doing a pretty good job of. So now we're moving toward to more specific sort of forms of prevention.
Now, I would imagine there's going to be a certain amount, we've heard the term cyberbullying a lot, and sexual abuse, I think, would kind of overlap or even be part of that. And we're starting to see in the news now stories of things like deep fakes. Everybody can Photoshop something now, and they can put somebody's head on somebody else's body, and they can create pornography where maybe perhaps it didn't exist in the real world. Are you seeing this as problems with teens? Is this a growing issue in that particular area?
Yeah, I think it's always a really big concern in the field about sort of like what's coming next. Right. And so when I started this work, we were talking about MySpace. That is not something that teens are doing anymore. And so I think that's even a huge part of the reason that we're not focusing on platforms or specific forms of technology anymore, because we've recognized that things are going to evolve and things are going to change, and research is slow. And so by the time we catch up, they're going to have something else. So TikTok is the big thing now, right? There's a lot of issues around sexual coercion and abuse in TikTok, but there's also some positive things that we'll talk about that are happening there as well. But so I think the field is trying to resist getting caught up in sort of different platforms, different forms of technology, and focus more broadly on this is a phenomenon that has existed. Sexual coercion, sexual abuse, victim blaming, slut shaming of girls and young women. Those things are things that we've been tackling for a long time, and now they've moved online. So yeah, I haven't specifically seen a lot of deep fake or fake pornography type stuff, but I still see a lot of this evolving pressure for sexual content, sharing of sexual content, and I'm sure that stuff is occurring and will occur, unfortunately. But it's not something that I've seen focused on specifically.
So we have spent a lot of time talking about all the negative impacts technology can have on relationships. So what are some of there have to be some positive ones. So what are they?
Yeah. And I spend so much time living in the negative parts of technology that I do try to balance. So anytime I talk to teens or do this work, I also ask them, what's good about technology, or what do you enjoy? Because I think there has to be that balance, because this technology is not going away. So we sort of have to also focus on what's positive about it. So what I hear from teens a lot is that it helps connect them and have them be less lonely, especially during the pandemic. I've heard a lot of teens say, I'm tired of being on Zoom, I'm tired of being online. But I will say that it's nice to have connection, and it's nice to have a way to talk to people. And I do feel less alone in general. So I think that that's really powerful. I think especially for teens who are in marginalized communities or teens with not a lot of diversity in their communities, it helps them to reach out to others in other places that share those identities. So LGBTQ youth, use the internet to connect with others and learn about those identities in a way that can be really positive. I hear a lot about long distance relationships. So teens who are in long distance relationships, and maybe during the pandemic, they all kind of felt like they were in long distance relationships. Really helpful to be able to FaceTime and Skype and sort of keep in contact with your friends. And a lot of teens are exploring their sexuality in healthy ways using the internet. So as I mentioned, sexting is usually a positive experience for most teens. And so they're really enjoying that form of sexual expression and sort of playing with their sexual identity and sexual behavior in a way that in some ways could be more safe, right? Because there's not a risk for, pregnancy or STIs or things when it's virtual. So I think there are some positives. In TikTok in particular, there have been some cool ways that teens are sort of exerting agency or taking their power back on TikTok by posting about their abuse experiences, using TikTok videos to process their abuse experiences in a way that I think is positive. And they get a lot of positive feedback from it. So I think there are positive things that are happening. But of course, in my work, I mostly focus on the risks and negative things that happen as well.
So, Dr. Reed, we are just about out of time. Is there anything that you'd like to add before we wrap things up?
I don't think so. I'm really glad that we're focusing on digital forms of abuse. I think when I started in this work, it was not something that was talked about 10 years ago, and I think it was happening. So I'm thrilled that the fields and advocates and practitioners are paying attention, and I think that will be really helpful. And there are lots of good online sources of information and research done on this topic if folks want to learn more.
Great. Where can people go to find out some more about that? Do you have any favorite particular websites or sources that you go to?
Yeah. An organization that sort of coined the term digital dating abuse is the organization Futures Without Violence. And they have a teen initiative called that'snotcool.com. that sort of started this conversation about digital abuse. And so that's a great place for people to go. My team has a website that links to a lot of resources and research that we've conducted. So our research team is called the Thriving Relationships Lab, and we're at the Arizona State University School of Social Work. And that website is www.thrivingrelationshipslab.com. And you can connect with me and my team and also some of the research and resources we've created.
Well, Dr. Reed, thank you so much for joining us. This has been really informative.
Great. Thank you so much.
This has been Prevention is Now. I'm Deb Bonner, preventionist and community advocate for Prairie Center Against Sexual Assault. If you would like more information on this program, you may call our offices at 217-744-2560 or send me an email requesting more information at dbonner@prairiecasa.org. Prairie Center Against Sexual Assault supports children and adult survivors of sexual violence through counseling and legal and medical advocacy in 11 central Illinois counties. Prairie Center offers coaching boys into men for male high school and college athletes, bringing in the bystander training for college campuses and sexual harassment prevention training for businesses and organizations in our area. Our main office is located in Springfield, Illinois, with satellite offices in Jacksonville and Taylorville, Illinois. And you can find out more about our services at our website at prairiecasa.org. This program is supported by a grant from the Illinois Department of Public Health and the Illinois Coalition Against Sexual Assault. Points of view or opinions contained in this program are those of Prairie Center Against Sexual Assault and our guests, and do not necessarily reflect the official positions or policies of these grantors. Thank you for listening.